there's 4 categories of business to be taken care of in step 8 and 9. So when I have the guys I sponsor do their 8-step list, I have them break it into 4 categories. And they can do it either with columns or they can do it in cards. It doesn't really matter. But the first category, because there's, in step 8 and 9, there's my business and there's God's business. And I have to separate what's my business from God's business. In step 8, it said we made a list of all persons we had harmed. And in the book, it says we already had it. We made it when we did inventory. So we're going to take all the names off of their resentment, fear, sex inventory. All the people where there's separation, that the relationships could use some mending. And we're going to put those in one of 4 categories. So we made a list, that's our business, of all persons we had harmed, and became willing to make amends to them all. And the willing element is God's business. And the reason you know that is on page 76, there's a prayer where we ask God for the willingness. And we don't just ask him once. It becomes a piece of spiritual business because it says we ask until it comes. So in other words, you make that a part of your prayer life until you find yourself knocking on their door. And that's the difference between fantasy willingness and actual willingness. Fantasy willingness is an expression of a noble intention without action. Because willingness without action is fantasy. Actual willingness is when you show up and you're knocking on their door. You're actually doing it. And so you have a group of people who you have the willingness, and then in step 9 it says we made direct amends to such people wherever possible. It's my job to make direct amends. It's God's job to make it possible. There's nothing in Alcoholics Anonymous I'm asked to do that's not possible. And so this has to do a lot of times with people that I don't know how to find them. I just had an amazing experience a few months ago. Before I got sober, in a blackout, I stabbed a guy, just about killed him. He was in intensive care for 8 weeks. I stabbed him with a big knife with a blade about that long, right through his lung and then in the side, and he almost died, and I went to jail. And he survived, and he wouldn't help the detectives press charges. They tried to do it without him, but without his testimony, they couldn't do it. And I searched for him for 35 years of my sobriety. I started searching for him when I was about 5 years sober. I couldn't find him. I did internet searches. I did everything. And then about a little less than a year, somewhere in the last year, I met a woman in Miami who worked for our Social Security division in the government, and I gave her all his information, and she found him. And he called me up, and I got to make amends to this guy, and it was after all these years. And it was a very cool thing to do, and he's still drinking. And before he called me, he went online and found talks of mine, which are on there. Somebody puts them on there. It's not me, but somebody puts them there. So he calls me up, and the first thing he says to me, he says, "I want you to know I forgave you all those years ago, and I forgive you now." I said, "Oh, okay." And then he said, "You're in AA, aren't you?" I said, "Yeah, I am." He said, "Well, I'm drinking a beer right now." I said, "That's fine. I'm good with that." And at some point in the conversation, he said, "You know, if I ever need to get sober," he said, "I'd call you." Nice. And he was on my list for a long time because I didn't have the wherever. God had to do that. I had the willingness, but I didn't have the wherever. So you have the people who you have the willingness, I mean, and not fantasy willingness, really, you're ready to go there today. You have the willingness and you have the wherever. You know what to do and where to go. You know how to find them. Then you have the people where you have the wherever, you know what to do and where to go. It's just your fear is overcoming you. Your fear of it's going to cost you too much money, or your fear of maybe they'll beat you up, or your fear of maybe they'll have you arrested, or and you want to be willing, but the truth is you're not. You're not. You can't picture yourself. You're not going over there. You're not going to do it. So in that group where you have the wherever, but you don't have the willingness, it becomes a piece of business with your prayer life. It's the book says we ask for the willingness and we ask until it comes. And then you have the group like my friend who I'd stabbed, where you have the willingness, but you don't have the wherever, and you have to wait. And I have watched some amazing things in this area where people pop up years later, and you look for them, and it's dead end, and then it comes up just at the right time. And it's God has an economy in his world. Nothing is wasted. And often in his timing is an exemplary of his economy, because if you would have found him when you wanted to find him, you would have made the amends and it would have been good for you. But when you find him, when God wants you to find him, it's not only good for you, it's good for him or her. There's a guy in Pennsylvania that's sober today because of an amends that I couldn't make. I tried to make in the first 5 years where I couldn't find the person. I found him when I was 17. And my making amends to her led me to a guy who I owed amends to, who when I was finally in contact with him, he got sober as a result of that. I remember he called me up. It was so fun. He owned a bar that I went to a lot because it was in crawling distance from the place I was staying. And some of you know what crawling distance means. You can get so drunk that you better be drinking somewhere near where you can pass out, right? And Jimmy would throw me out of his bar several times a week because I'm an idiot. I go in there, I start drinking, I run out of money, I start stealing, I get caught because I'm half drunk. I'm not a good thief. So I'm stealing people's drinks or their change off the bar, or he catches me going through some woman's purse and she left her purse there and went in the bathroom, and he manhandles me, thrusts me up and throws me out of the bar. Don't you ever come back there. And then, he liked me. I go back the next morning, I'm sick and shaking, and I go up and I have hanging my head, and I'm saying, I'm sorry, Jimmy, I won't ever do that again. You better not. He'd let me back in again. And I'd be good for a couple days. And then it's like, it's like I outgood myself or something. I can only be good for so long. And then I'd be drunk and run out of money again, and back to my old tricks. And so when he, the first thing he said to me after all those years, he said, "You're not really sober, are you?" I said, "Yeah, I am." He said, "No," I said, "You're not. I can't believe it. You're the worst drunk I ever saw." I said, "Jimmy, I haven't had a drink at that time, I think 17 years. I haven't had a drink in 17 years. He said, "Oh yeah, but you're smoking pot, right?" I said, "No, I'm not taking anything. I'm not doing." He said, "You're taking pills though, right? Something." I said, "Jimmy, I'm not doing nothing." He said, "That's impossible. How did you do that?" He said, "You're the worst guy I ever saw." I said, "I went to Alcoholics Anonymous," and he said, he said, I went to a treatment center. They made me go to some AA meetings. I couldn't, self-righteous do-gooders, couldn't stand them. I said to him, "Jimmy, AA groups are like bars. Remember in town there was gay bars, there were lawyer bars, there were cop bars. There were businessmen bars. There were heavy metal bars. There were country and western bars. There was a lot of different types of bars for different types of people. And you always found you could get a drink anywhere when you needed a drink. But some bars you'd feel a little more comfortable. I said, Jimmy, you've got to find your bar. You've got to find your AA meeting that's like your bar. And then be a part of it. Reach out to those people. And he went back to Alcoholics Anonymous as a result of that amends that I made to Anna, who led me to Jimmy. You never know. I have a friend, one of my very best friends passed away a few years ago, a guy named Clint Hodges, and Clint was just a wonderful guy. Clint had helped me a lot with some of the people I sponsored in amends. Clint was very, very structured and very no nonsense when it came to amends. You know, Clint would say things like, if you'd said to him, "Can I make the amends on the phone?" He'd say, "Did you do the harm on the phone?" You know, he always had those comebacks, those great comebacks. And Clint sponsored a guy named Tommy. Tommy was a burglar by night, and he washed windows by day, which is a really good combination. When you really think about it, it's the best of both worlds. You stake a place out in the daytime, you come back at night, right? And Tommy had broken into, I think it was 12 or 13, I think it was 13 houses in this one wealthy part of Los Angeles, a suburb of Los Angeles. And Clint's no nonsense. He says, you got to go to every one of those people. And by now, Tommy'd been working and he had some money and he's getting back on his feet. And so he started what Clint told him to do. He'd go to the house that he'd robbed, the first house, and he'd knock on the door. And the people would answer and he'd say, my name's Tommy so-and-so. Did you live here on such and such a date? And they said, yes, we did. And were you burglarized? And they say, yes, we were. Well, I'm the guy who did it, and I'm here to make this right, and here's some money, and I know this is probably not enough, but it's a beginning, and I'd like to make this right. And he went to the second house, and did the same thing in the third house. He got up to the last house, and nobody had him arrested, and he was amazed. He was sure that people would have had him arrested, and nobody did. And he went to the last house and he knocked on the door, nobody answered, and he came back again and knocked on the door and nobody was there. And he kind of gave up, but Clint was a no nonsense kind of guy. Clint stayed on his back. What about that last house? So after, a couple months later, Tommy goes back and he knocks on the door, and this time this little old man and woman answer the door. And he says to them, did you live here on such and such a date? And they said, yes, we did. And you were burglarized? And they said, yes, we were. Well, I'm the guy that did it, and I'm here to make it right. And they just had this weird look on their faces, and they said, please, come in, please. And as they come into the house, there was a big mirror in the foyer. And they said to him, well, why did you break the mirror in the foyer? And he said, well, I thought maybe there was a safe behind it. And they went, oh, okay. And they took him into the living room. They sat in the living room. There's a big painting of the father above the fireplace, and it had a slit through it, and it had been repaired. And they said, how come you tore that painting off the wall? And he said, well, once again, I thought there might be a safe behind it. And they went, oh, okay. And he reached in his pocket and he pulled out an envelope with some cash in it, and he slid it across the coffee table to them. And he said, I want you to have this, and I know it's probably not enough, but it's a beginning, and I will make the whole thing right. And they said, absolutely not. And they slid the envelope back to him. And he slid it back to them. He said, you don't understand. I need to make this right. And they slid the envelope back to him again. He said, you don't understand. You already have made it right, because up until this moment, we thought it was our son that burglarized us. And you see, you never know, do you? You think it's about you, because we're alcoholic. We think everything's about us. And sometimes it's not about us. sometimes there's ripples. It's like you take these right actions, it's like throwing a rock into a lake or a pond, and the ripples just go out, and you never know when they're going to hit the shore. They say that a practicing alcoholic negatively impacts a minimum of 10 people. I think that's an underestimate. I think I negatively impacted a lot of people. Every girlfriend, every employer, my family were devastated. The neighbors were embarrassed and inconvenienced. The police. I affected negatively a lot of people. And I think the mirror image of that is, I think every alcoholic who gets sober and really, truly throws themselves and goes out and seeks out everyone that they've ever hurt, regardless of the personal consequences, and then devotes their life to helping other alcoholics. How many people do we positively impact? Thousands? Hundreds? And then the people you sponsor who sponsor people. And what about the children of the people you hurt? What about the employers that have been so hurt over the years by people robbing them, and you're the first person that ever came and paid it back? You're the only one that ever paid it back. How many people do we positively impact? A lot. A lot. So, we're willing to go to any lengths. I'll tell you a couple little stories and then we'll move on. When I got sober, I talked a little bit about how my sponsor made me turn myself in to go to prison. And I followed his direction, and to my amazement, didn't have to go. And then the next thing he was on me about was my mother and father. And these people in AA, they have one-track minds. They're like a dog with a slipper. They won't give it up, man. And he started this thing about my parents. You need to make amends to your parents. And I said, well, it's too late, man. Too much damage. They won't even talk to me. He says, I want you to call your mother at least once a week. I said, listen, they won't take my calls. And he said, don't call collect. I'm embarrassed to tell you, I would have never thought of that. That's how selfish I am with such entitlement. Of course you call your parents collect. And I remember the first time I ever called them, and I had hurt them. I had devastated them until they would have nothing to do with me. And they loved me, but they couldn't take it anymore. They couldn't trust me. I stole so much from them. I disappointed them. I kept getting their hopes back up, to smash their hopes once again and again and again and again. And oh God, I really just devastated them. And so first time I called my mom up. My mom answers the phone and she hears my voice and she gets up, panicky. She goes, "What do you want?" And I said, and then she immediately jumped in. I started to answer her, and she immediately said, "Oh my God, you're back in Pennsylvania again, aren't you?" I said, "No, Mom, I'm in Nevada." She said, "You're in Nevada? Well, the operator didn't ask me to pay for the call." I said, "No, Mom, I paid for the call." And she shrieked in disbelief. She said, "You paid for the call?" She couldn't believe it. It was so out of character for me. And she did not want to talk to me. She couldn't even stay on the phone about a minute. I made her very uncomfortable. I scared her. She didn't trust me. I'd hurt her so many times. It's almost like she had a case of post-traumatic stress disorder from being my mother and loving me, right? And I kept calling. My sponsor said, "You got to call every week." And he said, you never miss Christmas, Mother's Day, Father's Day, their anniversary or birthdays. You have to send them something. Even if you can't afford much, you got to send them something. I remember the first Christmas, I owed my dad so much. God, I was his only son, and I just disappointed him, and I stole from him, and I borrowed tons of money from him, and never paid him back a dime. I had never, in all the Christmases in my life growing up, I was so selfish that even in the years, in my teenage years when I had jobs, I never spent a dime of my money even to buy them a Christmas present. In my family, my mother would buy me a Christmas present for my father and give it to me to give to my dad. My dad would buy a Christmas present for my mom, put my name on it to give, you know. Kind of pathetic, really. And in some of those years I was working. But that's how selfish I was. That's how inconsiderate I was. That's how self-involved I was. So it's the first Christmas I'm ever taking money of my own, but I don't have much. And I remember I got my head, the best I could do is I got my dad this necktie. It was like $9. It was pathetic. And after I bought it, I just got depressed. I didn't even want to give it to my father. You know, it was so pathetic. I remember, you know, I wanted to tell my sponsor, I don't want to do this. My God, if I gave my dad a brand new Bentley in a beach house, it wouldn't even scratch the surface how far behind I am with my father. My sponsor said, no, it's the thought that counts. And I'm, yeah, right. But AA party line stuff. So against my better judgment, I sent that into something from my mom out to them. And the week after Christmas, when I made my call to them, I'd been calling every week, and I only ever talked to my mother. My dad wouldn't get on the phone. He'd been really hurt by me. He wouldn't even talk to me. I was dead to him. And the week after Christmas, after my dad had received that necktie, was the first time he ever got on the phone. And his voice broke as he thanked me. And then the wall came up again because he was scared. I'd hurt him a lot. And he had to get off the phone. But for a moment, something had happened. And I kept it up. And I was a year sober, and they decided to come out to Las Vegas as a result of the actions that my sponsor had me take. They decided to come out to Las Vegas and eyeball me. Because they came out with this attitude of, because I've hurt them and disappointed them so much and conned them so much. They came to Vegas with the attitude that he's probably still a bum trying to con us, but you know, we've never been to Vegas, so it won't be a complete loss. And they came out, and I met them, and I went out to dinner with them, with my sponsor and his wife, and me and my mom and dad went out to dinner. And my sponsor encouraged me to invite them to my home group, and I wouldn't have thought of that. But my sponsor thought about it. And it was a brilliant thing to do because my mother and father got to see me in my home group. You'll never see a better version of Bob than when I'm in my home group. Yeah. I mean, I may go out, I'm capable of leaving that group and going out in the world being a jerk, but in my home group, I'm the best version of Bob you'll ever see. And I was, and it was a great home group. We had a lot of laughter. We had a lot of genuineness and love. And love, and they used to say that the foundation of that group was love and laughter. And we had a lot of both. And the old timers in that group just used to love to pick on the newer guys like me. Just pick on us, just make fun of us. They would have such joy and mirth about our problems, you know. And I guess guess you got to make useful use of what you can. And then I was sponsoring a few guys, and I'm picking on them, making fun of them, because AA functions on the first rule of plumbing: shit runs downhill. You know. And I remember watching. I was sitting, my mom, my dad, my mom, myself. And there was a woman in the meeting, and there was a lot of laughter and a lot of cool stuff going on. And there was a woman in the meeting who was sharing tearfully about how she finally got her kids back after quite some time, and how it had broken her heart to be away from her kids, and how she got them back. And I remember I could hear my mom lean over and whisper to my dad, "This is good. This is good." My mom ended up loving Alcoholics Anonymous. My dad, I don't know that my dad ever understood it. He died before he could have much experience with it. And they weren't alcoholics, and they didn't need AA. But they sure loved what it did to their son. And before they left, I was tasked by my sponsor to write down all the money I owed my dad, and it was a lot. I mean, just the times I drank away the rent money, the times I drank away, I didn't have any money to pay fines, where my car was busted and I needed to go to work, and my dad would get the transmission fixed, or, it was a lot of money. And I was told to put it all on paper and then approach my dad and see if there's anything I left out, and then to have a plan on how to pay him back. And the plan I'd come up with was going to take me 12 and a half years to pay my dad back. And I got to tell you something, when you're a year sober, that's a lifetime. 12 and a half years. So I sat down in the coffee shop of their hotel the day before they left to go back to Pennsylvania, and I had my sheet, and I started asking. First of all, I showed it to my dad, and I said, if there's anything left out, and I'd like to start making payments on this. And my dad said, "Rob," he said, we don't want you to pay that money. He said, "We're just delighted you're sober. This is the first time in years we had any hope that you're going to be okay. Whatever this AA thing is, it's just keep doing it. Just keep staying sober. Forget the money. We're just glad you're sober." And I was elated. I just got out of 12 and a half years of payments. I mean, I couldn't have been any happier if I'd have won a house. I mean, it was amazing. I hit the recovery lottery. I'm like excited. I said, "Oh, now I like amends. This is good." And I was on my way over to my sponsor's office to tell him the good news. I had a couple other financial amends. I was wondering if I could get them to see the light like my parents did. And I walk in, my sponsor's sitting at his desk. I walk into his office, and I'm excited. I'm like, "Really, this is very cool." And I've said to him, I did what you said. I presented the plan. I was going to pay my parents back. And my dad said I don't have to pay it. Isn't this amazing? And my sponsor looked at me and says, "I don't care what your dad said. That's your debt. That's your integrity. This is your recovery. You got to pay that back." And, there are times when you just think, "Oh, man, how did I get this sponsor? Jesus." Because there are people in AA that have sponsors that are nice to them. I mean, it's, if it's going to be bad for you, don't do it. I want that kind of sponsor, right? I want the sponsor that, instead of making amends to your boss, he tells you to go, "Well, just go take a hot bath." That's the kind of sponsor I want. But my sponsor was not self-indulgent. He was very principled, and he understood principles before personalities. And he told me, he said, "You have to make this right." And I said, "I don't know how." He said, "I don't know either, but I believe a way will be shown." And it was. Really quickly, I was working as a cashier in a store. And back in the U.S., all the coinage in the US was silver except for pennies up until the 1960s. The last silver coins were in, I think, it was either 1968 or 1969. Those were half dollars that were a smaller percentage silver. And then earlier, up until 1964, they were all silver. And plus there was some coins that were older, wheat pennies that were like, it had developed some value to collectors anyway. And my dad loved that stuff, and I ran a cash register. And there was a lot of that stuff in circulation. And my dad collected it all. And gold certificates that used to, in the US, the bills, the older bills used to say, we'll pay in gold. They would guarantee, and they had silver certificates. And we did away with all that stuff in our economy. But there was a time when there was a lot of that stuff, and it was still in circulation. My dad collected it, and I made a deal with my boss to buy that stuff. And with the intention, not of making the amends, but with the intention of, because that would have been silly, but with the intention of obtaining a nice sum of this stuff to give to my father one day as a really nice gift. And I started, and life's funny. Carl Jung used to talk about a principle called synchronicity. And synchronicity is a view of the universe that when you're willing to go from point A to point B and it serves the greater good and you can't get there, from the moment of desire, the universe starts rearranging itself slowly to make the impossible an eventuality. And I started getting lucky. I started getting raises and bonuses, and I was doing some side work for a guy. And I found myself in a few years, I'd accumulated the whole, little bit more than the total value of the debt and face value on these older coins and bills. I had a shoebox full of, I had one $500 gold certificate that were very, very rare. And $100 gold certificates and silver certificates. I had a box full of them. I had the whole debt. And I drove back with the mother, that was the woman who's to be the mother of my daughter, to Pennsylvania, and I gave all that stuff to my dad. And it blew his mind. He never expected it. And there was some major shift in the very universe that day. And something had happened between my father and myself, and between myself and myself. Something changed. And what it felt like to me is, it felt like, and I don't know that this is true, but it felt like for the first time in my life, my dad respected me. Maybe he always did, and I just couldn't feel it because I was blocked. I don't know. Maybe because I owed him, I didn't respect myself. But it felt like from that moment on, I was a man in my father's eyes, and he respected me. And I had about another year with my dad, and it was the absolute best year in my whole life with him. It was sweet. Our whole relationship had changed. And then he died about a year later. And my mother was devastated when he died. They had a really amazing marriage. They were inseparable. They were very, very loyal. They were always together. I mean, they just enjoyed each other's company. They had a great marriage. And when he died, she was so distraught and so depressed, and so the grieving process was horrible. And God did some cool stuff for my mom, and through a bizarre series of circumstances, somebody came out of nowhere, wanted to buy her house, and she thought, oh, what the heck, moved to Las Vegas. And, she wasn't even there but very long, and I introduced her to some guy her age that I got sober with, and next thing I know, they're living in sin. It was like, Jesus. And I had the absolute best years of my life with my mother. The guy she lived with, George, he went to a lot of AA meetings. He was really a great AA member. And my mom would go with him to the open meetings. She loved AA. She wasn't an alcoholic, but she just liked the laughter. She liked the whole deal. And she would go and talk. She'd talk to guys' moms and stuff that were, the kids in AA. She'd do that stuff. She loved it. She wouldn't go down. She went to one Al-Anon meeting, and she said, those women are too whiny for me. She must have hit a bad one. I don't know. She hit a bad meeting, I guess. I don't know. But she went to a lot of AA meetings. I mean, she went almost every day. She'd be at an AA meeting. We'd go to conventions together and stuff. It was amazing. It was the best years of my life with my mom. I used to be able to say to my sponsees, hey, listen, my mom's not even an alcoholic, and she's going to more meetings than you are. I loved saying that to guys, man. And my mom, George died, and it took the breath out of her life. And then all the grief came due from my dad and George all at one time, I guess. And it just devastated her. And she got terminal cancer just almost right away. In the big book, it says something that I think is true in both directions. It says that when the spiritual malady is overcome, we straighten out mentally and physically. I think also when our spirit is overcome, we get sick mentally and physically. And there's no way to medically prove that my mother got cancer and died because she gave up, because her spirit got sick and was just devastated with the loss of the two men in her life she loved the most. But it seemed that way. And I got to take care of my mom, and it was very difficult. She had lung cancer and emphysema both, and she tried to smoke, even when her body forced her to quit smoking, because at the very end, when she'd try to smoke, she'd go into these horrific, painful, racking coughing fits. And her body would not let her smoke anymore, and she had to quit. And she was not happy about that. She would have smoked. She would have kept on smoking if she could have. And I'd take care of her, and I'd go over there every day and spend some time with her. And she didn't want to go into a hospice. She just wanted to stay in her place. And I went over and took care of her every day. And I'd change her diapers, and I'd try to feed her and do those things and clean her up a little bit. And it was tough, very difficult. By the time she died, she was about 50 pounds. I mean, she was so wasted away, I could literally lift her up like this off the bed in order to move her to the other side of the bed to clean her up and clean up her. What a tough way to die. But I got to go there every day, and I got to make them. This was a further layer of amends that I was not aware that I owed until I was in the mix and I was taking care of my mom. And I started having the memories of when I was a little kid and I was sick, and how my mom was so devoted to taking care of me. And I realized something as I was taking care of her one day. I realized, I never thanked her. I never thanked her for all the sacrifices she made when I was a kid. How she went to work, and she didn't have to, but she went to work because I was so expensive with the rehabs and the stuff. How far she went out of her way. And I was so selfish, I never thanked her. And I would have never looked at that as an unmade amends. But I don't think amends are all about things you did wrong. I think amends can be made for things where you were just so selfish and so entitled that you never even recognized someone else's wonderful things they were doing for you. Because gratitude, when you're a chronic malcontent, it's hard to feel gratitude when no matter what you get, it's never quite enough. Right? Never. And I grew up, it's funny, as a child, my mother and father, there was a lot of love in my household. But I was so narcissistically self-involved. Before I ever picked up a drink, I couldn't feel the love. I could see it. I could understand intellectually that I was loved, and I could see the evidence of the love, but I couldn't feel it. My sister could feel it, but she doesn't have this spiritual malady that I got. But you can't love me enough. I'm like the black hole of love. You know what I'm saying? You can love me, love me, love me, love me, and I just go, is that all you got? You know, I mean, right? You can't love me enough. And isn't it odd that the way I imagined I would feel inside if the right people were loving me the right way, and how I fancied it would complete me and fill me up, that it never comes from you loving me. I had it backwards. It only comes when I'm putting it out. It never comes when I'm receiving it. And the reason I know that is I've had some amazing experiences with sponsees, or I've walked away from those experiences feeling a completeness that I've never imagined, a rightness in my life. It's the joy. The book, in the book, The 12 Steps and 12 Traditions, Wilson refers to it as the joy of living. I've known a lot of happiness, and I've known a lot of usefulness since I got sober. I would rather have the feeling of usefulness than the feeling of happiness, because happiness is fleeting and it evaporates quickly. Usefulness will change your whole position in the world. It'll allow you to put your head on the pillow at night, and there'll be a rightness about you and what you're doing, and everything lines up. Happiness just makes me want to look for more happiness. That's all right.